The Indigenous people of Australia endured a hard period of colonisation when the British declared Australia to be part of their empire. This genocidal period of colonisation was characterised by mass killings, a loss of freedom, and an unforgiving effort to destroy Indigenous culture. After the initial colonisation and land-taking, governmental policy was shaped by policy called protectionism, whereby Indigenous people had to be protected and westernised for their own good by the government. These policies led to what we now call the stolen generations. Some of these attitudes about Indigenous people are lazy and don't fit in with Western culture and values. The most negative stereotypes focus on conflict and difference, that they are a threat to existing order, and their behaviour is often represented to be irrational and out of control. Another representation of Indigenous Australians is that they are privileged in terms of the amount of welfare they receive in comparison to the impoverished non-Indigenous Australians. This is based on the assumption that they receive excessive amounts of government assistance. In recent years, Indigenous people have been in the news because of the new cashless welfare scheme. These news reports show two models of attitude formation working at once. One model is the governmental influence on culture, which tries to say that Indigenous people need to be on a cashless system, otherwise they will spend all their money on alcohol. The second is the media model, which more often than not portrays Indigenous people negatively. Indigenous people have rarely had control over the way they are represented. This is because mass media ownership, control and production in Australia is in the hands of non-Indigenous Australians. Media representations of Indigenous Australians are embedded within a racist framework and reproduce this framework. These negative stereotypes are also passed on through friends and family members. Anecdotally, I remember some family members tell stories about the criminality of Indigenous people who live in Redfern. I soon later discovered that it was the media that influenced this attitude, more specifically the Redfern riot in 2004. The riot was represented as emerging from Indigenous belief that TJ was unfairly targeted and his death was the fault of police because he was being unreasonably harassed. However, any police misconduct was silenced in media representations, which continues the us versus them representation. One stereotype that shouldn't exist in modern Australia, but is still very common, is the view that to be Indigenous, your skin colour has to be very dark. Due to Australia being a multicultural country, it's natural that people from all ethnic backgrounds have procreated. The problem is that this gives some people the opportunity to say that the past discriminatory behaviour does not affect people who are lighter skinned but still have the Indigenous background. The simplistic attitude towards ethnicity and culture arises from the lack of education about multiculturalism and a misunderstanding of history. Our educational system mostly teaches about Indigenous culture with only surface level analysis, and by doing so it misrepresents the current situation of Indigenous people. One important example is how the education system teaches that the acts of the stolen generations are in the past, and that now we have the policy of self-determination, where Indigenous people get to make their own decisions regarding their identity and culture. This gives us all the impression that the country has healed and now that Indigenous cultures and people are safe from the government. It makes the stolen generation seem like they are in the past, but actually there are people living now who aren't even 50 years old who have mental health issues, formed because of the stolen generations. It leaves out the role that intergenerational trauma plays in the current lives of Indigenous people, where the people who were abused deal with their issues with drugs and alcohol, and abuse their own family and friends, passing their trauma onto the next generations. To sum this point up, an attitude of Indigenous issues being in the past is fostered by an educational system that ignores reality.